you know, art kind of is almost part of the project of making of the social contract, right? So if you take nationalist art, nationalist art is about creating a visual language of the we, the people, the body, Japanese public sphere or Indian national modernity, right? Sometimes it can be at loggerheads and in opposition to the idea of the public sphere. I'm trying to understand what Dislocate is trying to do. And my reading of what Dislocate is trying to do, which situates itself in the idea, and this is something that Jay spoke about yesterday as well, the idea of the community practice. How does that relate to the question of this constitutive power, and what alternative imagination of the social contract does it potentially offer us?
そうだからそのアートっていうのは一方では、まさっき言ったようにそのナショナリスティックなものだとか、権威づけられたものだとかみたいなものっていうのをアートで表現するっていうものもあるんだけれども、ディスロケートが何に挑戦しようとしているのかっていうと、やっぱりそういったものを改めて問い直したり、要は反対側から見てみるみたいなことだとか、そういうなんか想像力っていうのを違う方向に持つようなことをしようとしてるっていうふうに見ている。
Have you heard the song by Rolling Stones called "Sympathy for the Devil"?
No.
Yeah, there was a very famous live performance that they had in Tokyo, actually, of this particular song as well. But basically, the song traces the devil as a kind of a shapeshifter who moves through history and moves through time and is present in all the major political events. So he says, I was there when Kennedy was killed, I was there when they blew the bomb, so it's a good, interesting song, but it's not very important for us. But what I want to look at is, if you look at historically, the artist and art has also been present at various moments of history where this idea of the social contract has been kind of, at stake or at play. So I want to look, for example, at the first moment of the social contract, which really begins with the French Revolution, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, where you move away sovereignty from the king or from a divine figure to something called the people, right?
社会契約の変革の時に、そのアートというのが結構重要な役割を果たしていて、なんでそのさっきストーンズの曲の話したかっていうと、悪魔がそういう変革の時に出てきて、私はこれを見てたみたいな話だったので出したんですけどっていうことで、まずそのフランス革命で社会契約っていうのが変革して、王様との契約っていうのから民衆が力を持ったこの流れについて。
So it's not like there was an automatic process where automatically, power devolves to the people. This working from the idea of the divine into the secular, or from the divine into the people, in some ways, visual art during the French Revolution played the role of making the translation of the divine into the secular, right? So very often, Rousseau, who is one of the kind of primary social contract theorists, would claim that you needed a figure like Moses, in the modern period, who would be just like Moses brought the 10 Commandments. You needed the establishment of an imagination of law. So a lot of the art of that period actually takes the figure of Moses, but creates a contemporary version, providing in a way, moving from Moses into a much more mass-based kind of moment, right? And the painting here that you see is Jacques-Louis David's The Tennis Court Oath, which is about a moment in which the declaration had been made that we will not leave this place until we establish a constitution in which power flows from the people. And a lot of the painting of this period is of a heroic nature, right? The people become the new locus, in a way, of a certain heroic divine celebration.
そのフランス革命の時に書かれた絵ですとか表現ですとか、そういったところに革命など変革を起こす時にはそのモーゼのような、存在が必要だっていうふうに言われていて、 そういう形でそのフランス革命の時の絵も描かれてます。でこれがダビッドの
The tennis court.
テニスコートの誓い。
テニスコートの誓いで、そこもまあその憲法が市民の気に渡るまではここ動かないぞという意思を絵で表現しています。
言ってみればこの絵がなんていうかな、政教分離っていう、セキュラーって言ってましたけども、政教分離っていうのを表していて、人々の力みたいなものとそのヒロイックなものに対してのその崇拝みたいなことを表している。
So in a way, art was charged with providing the optimism of constitutive power, the visual representation of an event which portrays a multitude ordered by a central force that mirrors, a certain kind of a spirit of national solidarity, right? And at its original point, the social contract which moves from the rule of God to the rule of law, the role in a way of visual culture and of art is almost what I would describe as a cultural notary public. A notary public is someone who attests your documents. So if you have an agreement or you have a land lease agreement, it needs to be attested by a public authority. The role of art in a way becomes they're like the emissary, they're the messengers of the social contract by attesting, to its publicness. So
アートが、何でしょうか、変革が起こったということの証明書というか印鑑というか、そういった役割を果たすことがあって、まさにこの絵なんかはそうなんじゃないかと思います。
So when I read the note of Dislocate and I looked at and thinking about some of the concerns, the one thing that struck me was that Dislocate is also inviting us to think of a social contract, but of a very different nature. It almost seems to be a social contract of an anarchist making, where the invitation is to think about a tradition in which art doesn't play the role of the emissary, but it plays an insurgent role in the constitutive moment of power.
なんかディスロケートはだからそういう社会契約っていうもの、今私たちの社会にある社会契約っていうものと、あとネイチャー、本質的なものっていうのを両方考えようとしている。
Yeah. And the invitation begins by looking at specific absences, right? In our case, the disappearance or the absence of a people, the absence in a way of the imagination of the public in a traditional art context. Again, the critique that Jay had of a certain modernist idea driven in a way by the figure of the author, but not, very regarding of the public that it caters to. Right? So this idea of the absence is something which is crucial in thinking about the social contract. Because the social contract, at the heart of the social contract, is also a paradox. And the paradox is that this is a constitutive moment of power in which the people who constitute it are absent. And the example of this is, have any of you signed the Japanese constitution? Have you signed the Singaporean constitution or the Indian constitution? Right?
憲法に署名したことがある人いらっしゃらないですね。
But doesn't this act of signing happen through symbols? For example, when I get an Indian passport, I'm signing the documents or the statements which make me an Indian, which is the constitution.
So there are various ways in which you will, get your citizenship and perform your citizenship. But I'm interested in the originary moment of the constitution. The idea of the constitution is that this is the moment of we the people giving unto ourselves. And it's supposed to be a contract. Because the social contract is a contract. So I'm interested, the basis of a contract are two parties signing an agreement. Right? So how does your agreement get, absorbed into the social contract? And I'll try and tease this out a little bit more. So.
契約、社会契約と契約の一種なので、まさにその契約でき 収されているというのを、まあ、考えてもうちょっと噛み砕いている。
So in a way, to look at in 1993 or 94, India had the nuclear tests, right? And at that point of time, Arundhati Roy, a famous author, wrote an article which got her into a lot of trouble. And what did she say? She said, "I hereby secede from the Republic of India. I declare myself a mobile republic." Right? It was a symbolic act. But can she actually secede from the Republic of India? That's where the passport comes in, right? Now, what does that mean? It means that, sorry, your signature is with us, right? And the signature is not just in the passport, it's in the original moment of the Constitution, right? Because the Constitution is what creates citizenship. I didn't choose it. If I don't choose it normally in a contract, choice is crucial. Consent is crucial. So what is it about the nature of the social contract where choice and consent are presumed? Right?
Are they presumed or are they assumed to happen through representation, and representation being a necessity because of the scale of the public that we are dealing
That's
with?
exactly the dilemma, right? So and that's where scale we come back to. This is large scale. Large scale requires representational forms which have nothing to do with medium or small scale, and that's where the tension is produced. Yeah.
1994年に、インドで原発核テストがあって、その時にある作家が、私はインドから独立しますというふうに書いたんですけど、実際それはできないことで、でも、まあ、それよく考えてみると、国と契約を結んで個人が存在しているはずなのに、そうではなくてもなんか選択するっていうことさえできないけれども、それは何かっていうと、そのさっき話したようなスケール感の問題があっていて、国っていうこととか、国の一つの問題っていうのがでかすぎて、そこに選択する社会契約をするっていうのは本来前提に立ち戻れないような状況なんですけど、その点を
Actually, the people who live in the country, whether they are citizen or not, they already automatically perform every day the acceptance of the authority. For example, the policeman. This is a classical analyzing of the performance of a policeman. When you see a policeman and the policeman asks you to stop, you automatically stop. You already perform, you recognize authority. You didn't employ this policeman directly. This policeman is employed by the state. But through the vested interest that you accept and live here, you accept this line of authority and you recognize the authority of the policeman in this visual and recognize. So you already perform an acceptance, then you accept also that social contract I think you thought about without even you personally say yes or no, because they will argue maybe as a layman, if you do not accept this country and this place you can leave. You can renounce your citizenship or you can go somewhere else. No? That's the
市
argument.
民が、まあ、こういうふうに普通に生活してる限りそういう権威みたいなものっていうのにはもうなんか自動的になんかこう受容している側面があって、特になんかこう警察とかっていうのは別になんか国家でも何でもないにもかかわらず国によってまあなんか雇われているっていうのを、そういう権威を傘にしたような感じで振る舞っていて、その人たちが止まれっていった私たちも自動的に止まってるから、この社会契約の中で、まあ、要は私たちもそれを十分に受け入れてるっていう現状がある。
So the reason I'm referring to this is to point out to a scandal at the heart of constitutive power, right? And the scandal is nicely described by Derrida as the absence of a people and the presence of a signature. Right? So we, the people, rarely participate in the debates, but yet the discursive we, the people, which is constituted as the collective subject of politics, is continuously used as those who are being spoken for. And this is the scandal. And this phrase is a really nice one, which is the presence of the signature and the absence of the people. So you're always present via the signature. Right? So
社会契約とサインが交わされているのってウィーンの 実際の人々の声で意見でも、はい、まあ、そこの、距離感について話したいと。
So, some metaphorical questions that arise is, when can a signature be forged? When is handwriting illegible? When is, in a way, the signatorial presence that you're supposed to have, when can it be erased?
その契約の書類の署名というのは消せるのか。皆さん。
He's using a method, so you cannot direct translate.
本当の証明ではなくて、作られた証明を使ってしまうから。本当のものである。
What he's asking is, when can you decide to disobey, disregard?
But in a very tactical kind of a material way. So,
社会契約あったこともなくて、それを出しにすることはできるのか。
So there are three ways of thinking about how the social contract can, the grand edifice can be crumbled a little. One is to think about it in terms of the exclusion, right? Who is included, who is excluded in the social contract. The second is in thinking about, how do I withdraw my consent? If I have a contract with you and I sell you this pen, and you say, and I tell you that you say I want a red pen, and I give you this pen, and you take it and you say it's a blue pen, so will you accept it or not? It's a choice you have, right? And she says, I'm sorry, I asked for a red, not a blue pen. I am withdrawing my consent from the contract. How does one withdraw one's consent from a social contract? And the third is, how do we reimagine the foundations of the social contract then? And I'll try to quickly address three of these. And I know this is a bit theoretical, so I will then go to my story about tigers, which will reveal many of these, dimensions.
誰が排除する、誰が、3つあって、どのように署名をなくすことができるのか3つあって、1番目が、誰が、どんな人を排除しているのか知らますか？
誰が含まれていて、
誰が排除されているのか。で、2番目は、
その契約からどうやって撤退するのか、契約を何に訳したらいいのか、なかったことをするのか。
で、3つ目が、どのように想像することができるか。何をですか？
なんていうの、そのあり方をもう一回新しく想像し直す。
そう、リコンストラクションみたいな、なんかもう、そう違うものを想像するにはどうしたらいいのかということです。で、裁判。
でも次ちょっとこれ非常にセオレティカルなので、これ話に見ていきたいと思います。
Have any of you signed, apart from the Constitution, any contracts that you haven't read? You do it every day.
それでないとやってそうです。
Yeah.
ネットでなんかやってるでしょ。
iTunes Store、
iTunes Store, Gmail, Facebook, Twitter. Every single day you are signing contracts that you haven't read. No human being apart from 5 lawyers have read those contracts, right? But all of you have signed it. And this is the thing about contracts. The myth of the contract is consent, it's freedom, it's absolute, meeting of minds. The reality of contracts is it's always one-sided. So there is something called the postal rule, which is in the heart of English contract law. The postal rule is, if Prior sends me an acceptance by post of his acceptance, regardless of whether I receive it, whether the letter is lost or it arrives, the contract is assumed to have been put into place, right? And the contract is over, it's formalized. This is, I won't go into the psychoanalytical theory, but basically Lacan has this entire thing of what happens if the letter doesn't arrive, right? And this is an example of a contract being completed even if the letter does not arrive, right?
But how is it assumed that the letter that's posted agrees?
Yes.
How is it assumed that it
Oh.
agrees?
If you have sent your acceptance and you say that I have sent my acceptance, it is assumed that I'm sorry that it didn't reach, but you telling me it has accepted. But this is a paradox, because normally, I mean, this is obviously an anomaly in the thing, right? But what it underlies is that you don't need to be a part of a contract to be a part of a contract. So,
契約はいつも一方的で、例えばそのトライアスはドレス契約書を回してそれが届かなかった、そういう逆の仕掛けなんですけど、それ届かなかった、全然見なかった、なくなった、そういうの関係なく送ったっていう事実があれば、それで成立したってことなんですね。
so there's a seamless kind of communication that's assumed. Now the challenge is, both in terms of politics as well as in terms of practices, how do we interrupt the seamless relationship between the sender and the receiver? In this case, the sender is the state, the constitution, we are the receivers, right? Regardless of whether or not we actually receive it, we are presumed to have accepted the social contract. What are the ways in which you can interrupt this? And I would suggest there may be two things. One is through thinking about this question of consent. The other is through bringing in the excluded other of the contract back into the imagination of the social contract. The excluded other could be a person, it could be a community, it could be languages, it could be a tiger. Yeah.
まあだからその同意がこれほどスムーズになんかこうやってしまう中で、センダーと要はそういうふうなコントラクト、契約のセンダーとリシーバーっていうのがいて、で送り手っていうのは結局国とかだったりして、リシーバーっていうのが、受け取り人は私たちなんだけれども、その中にどうやって私たちが介入していくことができるのか。で、2つあって、1つはコンセントなんですね。同意わかります ?2 つ。同意を
もしくは配慮されたものの人たちとか要素をそこにもう一度持ち込みか。
なるほど。
その2つのやり方。
はい。
One of the great figures of the withdrawal of consent was Henry David Thoreau, right? Thoreau, author of Civil Disobedience and Walden, basically decided that he will withdraw his consent, right? Why? Because he disagreed with a number of things. He disagreed with the slavery laws, and he disagreed with the need to pay tax to the government. So he withdraws into Walden, he gets arrested symbolically for a day, and he's released. And there's a lot that one can look at in terms of this idea of the withdrawal of consent. But I want to take just one element. Thoreau withdraws into the state of nature. Now, if you are familiar with social contract theory, social contract presumes the movement from the state of nature into political society. Right? So Thomas Hobbes famously said that life in the state of nature is nasty, short, and brutish. Now, by withdrawing into the state of nature, there seems to be an interesting reversal that happens. I'm slowly leading you into the jungles, when we will then encounter the tiger. So,
I mean, just one question.
Yeah.
When it is assumed,
yeah,
when the consent is assumed,
yeah.
is also the impossibility of dissent, is that also assumed?
Well, so that's part of the. So there isn't a single one. So if you take different social contractual theorists, in Locke, for example, there would be no dissent whatsoever. Whereas in Young and in Hobbes, in Locke and in Rousseau, there would be varying degrees of dissent, right? But the fundamental question, which is the giving up of your right so that you enter into a social contract, that you cannot Now get out. Because then you'll be expelled from the state of from the social contract into the state of nature, which is being cast out into the domain of the non-citizen. It's the non-human, right? So that's the domain occupied by the immigrant. That's the domain occupied by the illegal refugee. In other words, the statusless person.
Also the aboriginal.
Absolutely. That's the and I'm coming to the state of nature. That's the foundational violence of the social contract. So.
まあ、その社会契約っていうのはその社会の中に書かれるので、社会の外に出てしまうと契約自体が成立しない。それをやったのはソロで参加で、社会が平気で法に帰って、今隣にもあったりしたので、なんでまあそういったその社会の外から出てしまえばその契約を保護にするっていうことはない。
So this state of nature, the question is, what was it? Was it a metaphor? Was it an empirical state of nature? Was it a historical state of nature? You know, what were these social contractarians referring to as the state of nature? Was it a fiction that they were creating from which they built a theory? So you look at it historically, people like John Locke were of course writing in a time of colonial appropriation in which the state of nature was defined as the savage lot who did not have private property. So what defined civilization was the rule of private property, because private property demanded laws. Laws governed humans. Laws are what distinguish between savagery and civilization, right? So the state of nature was predicated on this division between the primitive and the modern, but also very crucially on this question of boundedness, rules and boundedness of property and property ownership.
市民社会の文明に生きてるっていうのは結構土地を持ってるか否かっていうことに定義されているんだけど、要はその自分のこう縄張りを持ってるかとか、それがないものっていうのは文明の外にいる野蛮なものだっていうそういう考えがある。
So indigenous people who did not have the idea of individual property, and this is crucial because ideas of personhood and ideas of property have always been linked together, right? So the idea that you are a person, right, comes in a way from theories of property which talk about the ownership of personhood or the ownership of your personality. And all of this will be connected, I hope, to the neighborhood that we're going to talk about. So the savages, or the aboriginals, they were savages because they did not have an idea of ownership as property. What they instead had were cosmological, they had animistic cosmologies that informed their relation to rocks, to animals, to trees, to water, etc. And the Enlightenment mind saw this animistic perception as primitive superstition, right? So the indigenous people could never be sovereign, and you have to be sovereign to enter into a social contract, because they were incapable of forming or entering into any social contract since they preceded the formation of civilized sociality.
その文明の外にいるそのもともとそこにいた人たち、例えば日本で言えば多分アイヌとか、オーストラリアではアボリジニとか、そういった人たちって考え方自体が違うので、その自分で所有するっていう考え方がないので、そういう西洋的なその文明の中に入っていくっていう、そことは全く別な生き方をするしかない。
And as the descendants of modernity, as the descendants of a certain kind of an idea of the Enlightenment, all of us are in a way also conditioned into accepting the narrative of the social contract. The question is, are we condemned to accept it as it is, or are there ways in which we can begin to reimagine it? And this is where I will stop my theory and I will start telling you an alternative story, right? And the story that I want to tell you distinguishes between two kinds of communities. Sorry.
染まってしまっている。
それが当然となってしまうので。